It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian Thorne laughed as he poured the vintage Cabernet over Maya Sterling's cream silk blouse in front of the entire charity gala committee. The dark, heavy liquid bloomed across her chest like a violent ink blot, the acrid scent of fermented grapes and expensive oak filling the air between them. Beside him, Serafina Sterling giggled into her manicured palm, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Beatrice Sterling, their mother, didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her pearls and looked toward the gala's centerpiece, her silence a sharp, polished blade of disapproval. "Oh, Maya," Julian said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the marble foyer of the Thorne estate. He didn't look sorry. He looked exhilarated, his eyes scanning the faces of the 3 board members who stood nearby, wine glasses frozen halfway to their lips. "I suppose that's what happens when you try to handle things that are out of your tax bracket. You've always been a bit clumsy with luxury, haven't you?" Maya didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She stood perfectly still, feeling the cold, cloying weight of the wine soaking through the silk to her skin. She looked at Julian Thorne. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that she knew, with clinical certainty, had been charged to a secondary account he believed was an inheritance from his late grandmother. In reality, it was a subledger of the Sterling family trust, a trust Maya had been auditing in secret for 6 months. "It's fine," Maya said. Her voice was a flat, dead calm. "It's a $5,000 Chanel, you mouse," Serafina chimed in, stepping forward to snap a photo on her gold-cased phone. The flash was a momentary, blinding sting. "Or it was. Now it's a rag. Maybe you can wear it to your little cubicle tomorrow. It fits your aesthetic better anyway." Alastair Thorne stood by the fireplace, his sharp eyes tracking the interaction. The patriarch of the Thorne Empire was a man who built his legacy on the cold, hard truth of numbers, and he looked at his son with a flicker of something that wasn't quite pride. He caught Maya's gaze for a heartbeat. He saw the lack of tears. He saw the way her fingers weren't shaking, but rather tapping a rhythmic, silent code against her thigh, a habit she had when she was processing large sets of data. "Julian," Alastair said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "That's enough, get her a towel." "She can get it herself, Dad." Julian dismissed him, turning back to the committee members who were watching the spectacle with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. "Maya's used to cleaning up. It's her only real talent after all. Right, Beatrice." Beatrice finally spoke, her tone weary and dismissive, not even glancing at her eldest daughter. "Go upstairs and change, Maya. You're making the guests uncomfortable, and try to be less visible for the rest of the evening." Maya turned without a word. She walked up the grand staircase, the rhythmic click of her heels on the marble sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. Every step was a calculation, a data point being moved into place. She reached the sanctuary of the guest suite and closed the door, the heavy mahogany thudding shut with a finality that felt like a gavel. She didn't go to the bathroom to scrub the stain. Instead, she reached into her small, unassuming clutch and pulled out her phone. A notification was waiting. A forensic alert she'd set on the Thorne Sterling joint venture account had just been triggered. Transaction flagged, $12,400 Thorne Bespoke Tailors. Status pending. She felt a cold, sharp thrill run through her chest. Julian thought he was the master of this house, the heir to a fortune he hadn't earned. He thought Maya was the quiet, invisible daughter who lived on spreadsheets and silence. He didn't realize that spreadsheets were maps, and she had already found every one of his hidden exits. She pulled a small, encrypted thumb drive from a hidden pocket in her clutch. It was a cold, metallic weight in her palm. Marcus Reed had delivered the final piece of the puzzle an hour before the gala. The recorded conversation between Julian and Serafina, discussing how they'd diverted the Sterling trust funds using Maya's forged signature to cover Julian's mounting gambling debts. Maya looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The wine stain looked like a chest wound, but her eyes were clear, bright, and utterly lethal. She touched the screen of her phone, her thumb hovering over the execute command for the first phase of her audit report. This wasn't just about the wine. It wasn't even about the dress. It was about the 5 years of being treated like a ghost in her own home, while they spent her birthright on champagne they didn't know how to pour. "Vinegar," she whispered to the empty room, the acrid scent of the wine filling her senses. "It's amazing how quickly things turn sour when you don't know how to preserve them." She hit the enter key. The first domino fell. Downstairs, she heard the faint, muffled sound of Julian's laughter and the clink of crystal. It was the sound of a man who thought he'd won. Maya checked her watch. In exactly 48 hours, the Thorne estate would be hosting the final signing of the merger. The moment Julian had been waiting for his entire life. She didn't change the dress. She grabbed a silk wrap from the bed, covering the stain just enough to be polite, but not enough to hide the evidence of his cruelty. She wasn't going to hide. She was going back down there. She wanted to be in the room when Julian Thorne tried to buy his next round of celebratory drinks. She wanted to be the first thing he saw when he realized his world was starting to bleed. The game hadn't just started. Maya Sterling had already won. Julian just hadn't been served the bill yet. She opened the door and stepped back into the hall, her eyes fixed on the stairs. The countdown had reached 0. The next morning, the Sterling estate was suffocatingly quiet, the previous night's gala reduced to the cloying scent of wilted lilies and the distant, rhythmic hum of a vacuum. Maya Sterling sat in the sun-drenched library, her laptop a cold, silver weight on the mahogany desk. While her mother, Beatrice Sterling, was likely already downstairs coordinating the damage control for the wine-stained dress incident, she was focused on a different kind of cleanup. Her clinical mind, trained to find the ghosts in the machine of corporate ledgers, felt unusually sharp. A notification pinged. An encrypted file from Marcus Reed had finally bypassed the firewall. She clicked it open. The data hit her like a physical blow. There it was, a series of shell companies with names like Thorne Alpha and Thorne Beta, all funneling capital into a private offshore account. The account holder wasn't Julian Thorne. It was her. He hadn't just been spending her trust. He'd been building a house of cards using her credit score as the foundation, effectively making her the primary debtor for his secret failures. The heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Julian stepped in, looking far too polished for someone who had spent the night celebrating a fraud. He didn't even look at her, heading straight for the sideboard to pour a glass of sparkling water. The sound of the effervescence was loud in the silence. "Still at it?" he asked, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that made her skin crawl. "You know, Maya, a forensic auditor is just a fancy term for a glorified bookkeeper. You should really spend more time on your appearance before the merger signing tomorrow. Alastair Thorne expects the Sterling family to look like they actually belong in the top 1%, not like the help." She didn't look up from the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. "Alastair is a man of ethics, Julian. I wonder how he'd feel about the lack of transparency in the Thorne Alpha filings." He paused, the glass halfway to his lips. For a fraction of a second, his posture stiffened, the confident line of his shoulders faltering. But the arrogance returned like a reflex. He turned, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his designer watch. "I have no idea what you're talking about, but I love that you're trying to sound relevant," he said, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive, woodsy cologne. "Just make sure you wear something that doesn't attract wine tonight. Serafina mentioned you looked quite damp when you ran upstairs last night. It was the highlight of her evening." The mention of her sister, Serafina Sterling, stung exactly how he intended. She knew Serafina had seen Julian pour that wine, had seen the humiliation, and had likely laughed about it over brunch. The betrayal was a coordinated effort, a family tradition of choosing the shiny lie over the uncomfortable truth. "I'll be there," she said, her voice like a scalpel, cold and precise. "Good, because once this merger goes through, I won't need to play nice with the bookkeeper anymore. You'll be lucky if I keep you on as a consultant for my tax returns." He set the glass down with a sharp clack and sauntered out, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. She waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before scrolling further down the report. There was one more document at the bottom, a signature page for a bridge loan worth $4 million. She zoomed in, her pulse quickening. The signature was hers. The loops of the M, the sharp cross of the T, it was a perfect imitation. But the date was the smoking gun. It was dated 3 days ago, a day she had been in London for a conference, documented by a dozen flight and hotel receipts. Julian hadn't just stolen her identity. He had committed a felony in her name to secure the very merger he was using to belittle her. She leaned back, the leather chair creaking. The rage was there, a slow-burning coal in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a cold, calculating satisfaction. He thought he was the master of this game, but he'd left a trail of digital blood across her accounts. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Alistair, it's Maya Sterling. I think we need to discuss the audit for the Thorn merger. There's a discrepancy I can't seem to resolve on my own, and I'd hate for your family name to be attached to anything. Fraudulent." She watched the cursor blink on the screen, a heartbeat in the dark. The countdown wasn't just for the merger anymore. It was for the moment Julian realized the woman he dismissed as a bookkeeper was about to audit his entire life into the ground. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. One more day until the paper trail led straight to his front door. 2 days later, the morning fog clung to the city like a damp shroud, muffling the sounds of the early traffic. Maya Sterling sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, her fingers tracing the sharp edge of a manila envelope. Inside lay the fruits of Marcus Reed's labor, high-resolution photographs of Julian Thorn meeting with a known shell company architect, and bank statements that Marcus had liberated from a private courier. The paper felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the trap she was meticulously setting. Marcus turned from the driver's seat, his expression unreadable. "It's all there, Maya. The offshore accounts are tied directly to your stolen credentials. He wasn't even clever about it. He used your middle name as the encryption key for the sub-accounts." "Arrogance usually leaves the front door unlocked," she replied, her voice steady. She tucked the envelope into her slim briefcase. "Thank you, Marcus. Keep the secondary surveillance on Serafina. I want to know exactly what she's promised our mother." "You've got it, but be careful. Julian is getting desperate. He's leveraged everything on this merger." Maya stepped out of the car and walked toward the iron gates of the Sterling estate. The scent of damp boxwood and expensive mulch filled the air, the smell of old money trying to hide the rot underneath. She had been summoned for a family briefing, a term Beatrice Sterling used whenever she intended to issue orders. As Maya entered the morning room, the sound of laughter grated against her nerves. Julian Thorn was draped across a velvet armchair, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand despite the early hour. He looked up, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "The prodigal bookkeeper returns," Julian said, his voice dripping with mock affection. He stood up, smoothing the front of a bespoke navy suit that Maya knew cost $5,000, money he'd siphoned from her personal trust. He checked his wrist, flashing a new gold Patek Philippe. "You're late, Maya. Some of us have empires to build. And some of us are just playing dress-up with other people's clothes," Maya said calmly, walking past him to the sideboard. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, the steam warming her face. Serafina Sterling sat on the sofa, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression. She didn't even look up. "Don't start, Maya. Julian is doing us a favor by keeping the Thorn name attached to this family. God knows your auditing isn't bringing in any social capital." The door opened, and Beatrice Sterling swept into the room. She was the picture of icy elegance in a pearl-colored sheath dress, her hair pinned back with surgical precision. She didn't offer a hug or a smile. She simply took her place at the head of the table. "Sit," Beatrice commanded. The room went silent. "We are 48 hours away from the Thorn Sterling gala. Alistair Thorn will be there to personally sign the merger intent. This is the most important night for this family in a decade." "I'm aware," Maya said. Beatrice leveled a chilling gaze at her. Then you will act like it. I've heard rumors, Maya. I know you've been asking questions at the firm. I know you've been looking into Julian's personal accounts. Julian leaned back, his smirk widening. She's just jealous, Beatrice. She can't handle that I'm the one Alastair trusts with the Thorn legacy. It's not about jealousy, Beatrice snapped, silencing him. She turned back to Maya. It's about the Sterling mandate. Family image comes before personal grievances. If you disrupt this gala with your petty suspicions, I will personally ensure you are removed from the trust and the firm. Do I make myself clear? Maya felt the familiar sting of her mother's dismissal, a coldness she'd lived with her entire life. Beatrice didn't care that Julian was a fraud. She cared that the neighbors might find out. Perfectly clear, Maya said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, cream-colored card, the official invitation to the gala. She laid it on the table. I'll be there, and I'll bring everything the Thorn family deserves to see. Julian chuckled, oblivious to the double meaning. That's the spirit. Maybe wear something that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack for once. We wouldn't want people thinking the Sterlings are struggling. Maya looked at him, really looked at him. The stolen watch, the stolen suit, the stolen confidence. She felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. She touched the briefcase at her side, feeling the weight of the evidence Marcus had provided. Don't worry, Julian, she said, her voice a soft, dangerous silk. I have the perfect outfit planned. It's going to be a very revealing evening. She stood up and walked toward the door, leaving her coffee untouched. As she reached the threshold, she paused and looked back at her mother. 2 days, Mother. I hope the Sterling name is as strong as you think it is. Maya stepped out into the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She pulled out her phone and sent a one-word text to Alastair Thorn. Confirmed. The countdown had moved from days to hours. She could almost hear the ticking of Julian's expensive, stolen watch, marking the seconds until his entire world collapsed in front of the very people he had spent a lifetime trying to impress. She didn't need her mother's approval anymore. She just needed the lights to stay on long enough for everyone to see the truth. The morning before the gala, the scent of expensive sandalwood and floor wax hung heavy in the air of the Thorn estate's private study. Maya Sterling watched from the doorway as Julian Thorn sat at his father's desk, his feet propped up on the mahogany surface. He was scrolling through a tablet, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips as he reviewed the guest list for the evening that was supposed to cement his status. He looked every bit the heir he pretended to be, wearing a watch that she knew had been purchased with a diverted dividend from her own trust. "You're still here?" he asked without looking up. His voice was thick with the casual cruelty he reserved for those he considered beneath him. "I thought you'd be buried in spreadsheets at the firm. Don't you have some thrilling data to crunch?" She stepped into the room, her heels muffled by the thick Persian rug. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a small, cold piece of plastic that contained the digital obituary of his reputation. "The audit is finished, Julian. It was illuminating." He finally looked at her, his eyes scanning her simple charcoal suit with visible distaste. "Illuminating? How quaint. While you're playing with numbers, Serafina and I are preparing to lead the Sterling legacy into a new era. You should be grateful we're keeping the family name relevant. God knows your clinical approach would have us in the dark ages." He stood up, walking toward a gilded mirror to adjust his silk tie. The arrogance in his posture was a physical weight in the room. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked his every movement, recording the theft of her father's mannerisms. "The numbers don't lie," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the heat he expected. "Sometimes the things we think are most secure are actually the most fragile. A single decimal point out of place can bring down an entire empire. You should check your balance, Julian. Things aren't always what they seem on the surface." He let out a sharp, barking laugh. He turned, leaning against the mirror, his reflection doubling his condescension. "Is that a threat from a data auditor? What are you going to do, bore me to death with a pie chart? You don't have the spine for real power. You're a ghost in your own house, and tomorrow night, the world is going to see who the real Sterling is." He walked past her, his shoulder intentionally brushing hers, a calculated display of dominance. He smelled of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. "I'd be careful with that word," she murmured as he reached the door. "Real." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Go back to your office. Leave the heavy lifting to the people who actually know how to handle influence. And for heaven's sake, try to find something to wear tomorrow that doesn't scream entry-level employee. It's embarrassing to the family." He disappeared down the hall, his laughter echoing against the marble walls. Maya didn't flinch. She turned to the desk he had just vacated. Her fingers grazed the cool surface of the mahogany, feeling the vibration of the house as a door slammed in the distance. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened a secure link. Marcus Reed had sent the final file, a high-resolution scan of the original trust documents Julian had forged, paired with the metadata showing the exact IP address used for the digital signature. She looked out the window at the manicured gardens. In the distance, she could see Serafina Sterling in the pavilion, surrounded by ring lights and assistants, filming a promotional video for her followers. Her sister was holding up a diamond necklace, a sterling heirloom that had been borrowed from Maya's private vault without a second thought. The rage was there, a low-frequency hum in her chest, but she channeled it into the cold, sharp precision of her plan. She wasn't just going to take back her money. She was going to dismantle the very reality they had built on her back. She checked her watch. 20 hours left. She opened her laptop and began the final upload to the gala's presentation server, using the administrative credentials Alastair Thorne had quietly provided. The file name was innocuous, Sterling Foundation Tribute, MP4, but the content told a different story. She closed the laptop with a satisfying click. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Every tick was a second Julian didn't know he was losing. She felt a strange sense of peace. The warning had been given and ignored. The audit was complete. All that remained was the public release of the findings. Maya walked to the window, watching the sun begin to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the estate. Tomorrow, the shadows would finally have names. The evening of the Sterling Foundation Gala arrived with a calculated, frigid elegance. The grand ballroom of the Thorne Sterling Plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast fractured, diamond-like light across the room. Maya Sterling stood near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the velvet-draped railing of the mezzanine. She breathed in the heavy, cloying scent of 3,000 white lilies, the exact floral arrangement Julian Thorne had insisted upon, despite the foundation's dwindling liquidity. She checked her watch. 7 o'clock. In exactly 40 minutes, the tribute video would play. Maya smoothed the front of her gown. It was a deep, midnight navy, understated, architectural, and costing more than the entire influencer wardrobe Serafina had borrowed from the family's emergency fund. She felt the cool weight of her phone in her clutch, a digital detonator linked to the ballroom's projection system. She was the only person in this room who knew that the foundation's accounts were currently hollowed out like a rotted tree. "There you are," a voice dripped with practiced condescension. Julian Thorne stepped into her line of sight, looking every bit the golden heir in a bespoke ivory dinner jacket. He held a glass of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in a frantic, golden stream. He didn't look at Maya's face. His eyes raked over her dress with a visible sneer. "I thought I told Mother to keep you in the administrative suite tonight," he said, his voice low enough to stay under the swell of the string quartet but sharp enough to cut. "This is a night for the faces of the company, Maya. You look like a librarian who got lost on her way to a funeral." Maya didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a clinical, terrifyingly calm focus. "The accounts are finalized, Julian. I thought I should see the result of all that. Hard work." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Hard work? You moved numbers around a spreadsheet. I'm the one who secured the donors. I'm the one who built the vision." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive bourbon and arrogance radiating off him. "Don't get ideas about your importance. You're a glorified clerk. Stay in the shadows where you belong, or I'll have security escort you out for emotional instability. It wouldn't be hard to convince Mother you've finally snapped under the pressure. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel, moving toward a group of tech moguls with a broad, false smile. Maya watched him go, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry. She was observing a specimen in its final moments of habitat dominance. He's particularly insufferable tonight, isn't he? Maya turned to see Alistair Thorne standing a few feet away. The older man looked weary, the lines around his eyes deepened by the harsh ballroom lights. He held no drink, and his posture was stiff, as if he were bracing for an impact only he and Maya could see coming. He believes he's reached the summit, Maya said quietly. Alistair looked at the stage, where the massive LED screen displayed a looping logo of the Sterling Foundation. The higher the climb, the more certain the gravity. Is everything in place? The audit is complete, Alistair. The truth is already on the server. I'm just waiting for the audience to take their seats. He nodded once, a sharp, somber movement. I've spent 40 years building the Thorne name. I won't let my son bury it in a shallow grave of fraud. Do what you have to do. As Alistair moved toward the VIP tables, Maya was intercepted by Beatrice Sterling and Serafina Sterling. Her sister was draped in gold sequins, her phone held aloft as she filmed a slow-motion outfit check for her followers. Beatrice, meanwhile, looked like she was vibrating with nervous energy, her fingers twisting the heavy pearl necklace at her throat. "Maya, for heaven's sake," Beatrice hissed, grabbing Maya's arm. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Why are you standing here? Go find the caterer. The caviar service is 3 minutes late, and Julian is already complaining about the temperature of the Sauvignon Blanc." "I'm not the event coordinator, Mother," Maya said, her voice like ice. "You're whatever we need you to be to make this night perfect," Beatrice snapped. "Do you have any idea how much is riding on this? Julian is announcing the expansion tonight. If the donors see you lurking around looking like a cloud of gloom, it ruins the aesthetic." Serafina lowered her phone, pouting at the screen. "Seriously, Maya, you're ruining my background. Move to the left, and maybe try some lipstick. You look ghostly." Maya looked at her sister, then at her mother. These were the people who had stood by while Julian systematically stripped her of her identity and her inheritance. They hadn't just allowed it, they had facilitated it for the sake of an aesthetic. "The night will be perfect," Maya said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made Beatrice blink in confusion. "In fact, it's going to be the most memorable night the Sterling family has ever had. You won't have to worry about the caviar in a few minutes. No one will be thinking about the food." She stepped past them before they could retort, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She made her way to the back of the room, near the sound booth. Marcus Reed was there, dressed as a technician, a headset resting around his neck. He gave her a subtle thumbs up. The administrative credentials had worked. The file was locked, encrypted, and ready for the 7:40 p.m. slot. The lights in the ballroom began to dim. A hush fell over the 300 guests as the chime for the program sounded. It was a beautiful, resonant sound that signaled the beginning of the end. Julian Thorne stepped onto the stage. He stood at the mahogany podium, the spotlight catching the gold embroidery on his lapels. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. He looked out at the room of billionaires and city leaders, his smile radiating the absolute confidence of a man who believed his own lies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers, "tonight, we don't just celebrate the past. We celebrate a future built on transparency, legacy, and the unshakable strength of the Sterling name." Maya stood in the darkness at the back of the room, her thumb hovering over the execute command on her phone. She watched him spread his hands wide, inviting the applause that thundered through the hall. "Before we begin our keynote," Julian continued, his eyes gleaming with triumph, "I want to share a special tribute, a look at the true heart of our operations." Maya pressed the button. The screen behind Julian flickered. The looped logo vanished, replaced by a black screen with a single line of white text. "Internal audit, discrepancy report 1. Julian didn't see it yet. He was still smiling, waiting for the music to swell. He didn't notice the sudden, confused murmur that began to ripple through the front rows. He didn't see Alistair Thorne lean forward, his face hardening into a mask of stone. Maya felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. The countdown was over. The shadows finally had names, and in 10 seconds the entire world would see them. The applause didn't die out all at once. It curdled. It began with the front row, where the heavy hitters of the financial world sat, their expensive silk suits rustling as they leaned forward to squint at the towering LED screen. The smell of stage fog and expensive floral arrangements felt suddenly cloying in the sudden, heavy silence. Julian Thorne remained center stage, his teeth white and flashing in a smile that was rapidly becoming a mask. He hadn't turned around yet. He was still feeding on the adulation he thought was his. Maya Sterling stood in the wings, her fingers resting lightly on the cold, brushed aluminum of the control tablet. She watched the blue light of the screen reflect off the back of Julian's head. The document displayed behind him wasn't the glowing testimonial he'd expected. It was a side-by-side comparison, Julian's personal spending accounts and the Sterling Trust's unauthorized disbursements. In the center, highlighted in a clinical, piercing red, was the digital signature used to authorize the transfers. It wasn't his. It was hers, or rather, the digital ghost of her identity he had spent 18 months wearing like a stolen coat. Julian finally turned. The motion was slow, almost graceful, until his eyes hit the giant text of the internal audit. Julian's face didn't just lose color. It seemed to physically erode under the harsh spotlight. The artificial tan he'd cultivated for the gala turned a sickly, bruised gray, making his skin look like damp parchment. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a microscopic twitch that he couldn't suppress, while a single, frantic pulse throbbed in his temple. His eyes, usually so full of practiced, predatory charm, darted across the rows of numbers, widening in a look of raw, unadulterated terror as they landed on the specific shell company names. He looked smaller, the tailored lines of his tuxedo suddenly appearing too large for a man who was shrinking in real time. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline and tracked a slow, glistening path down his cheek, reflecting the blue light of the evidence that had just ended his life. "There seems to be a technical difficulty," Julian stammered into the microphone. The feedback shrieked, a piercing wail that made the audience flinch. Alistair Thorne stood up from his seat in the center of the front row. The elder man's face was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed not on the screen but on his son. Beside him, Beatrice Sterling let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her throat to clutch her pearls, so hard the string looked ready to snap. Serafina, sitting on the other side, had gone deathly pale, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she could disappear into the expensive carpeting. She knew the trail wouldn't stop at Julian. Maya stepped out from the shadows of the curtain. The click of her heels on the wooden stage was the only sound in the cavernous hall. She didn't hurry. She walked with the measured, rhythmic pace of a predator who had already won. Julian saw her. His shock curdled into a desperate, cornered rage. "You did this," he hissed, the microphone catching his jagged breath. He lunged toward her, his hand outstretched as if to grab her arm, but he stopped short when two security guards, men Alistair had quietly signaled from the side, stepped onto the stage. "She's lying. This is a fabrication. Maya is unstable." Maya stopped 5 feet from him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was so absolute she could hear the hum of the high-end projector cooling fans. "The data doesn't lie, Julian," she said, her voice cool and resonant, carrying to the very back of the hall. "And neither do the forensic markers. You told me once that I didn't belong in a room like this, that I was just a ghost in the machine." She looked past him to the audience, meeting Alistair's grim gaze, then looked back at the man who had stolen her life. "You were right about one thing," she whispered, loud enough for the front row to shudder. "I am a ghost, and I've come to collect what's mine." She turned on her heel, her dark dress swirling around her ankles. She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the security guards close the distance or to hear the roar of the crowd as the realization fully set in. She walked off the stage and through the side exit, the heavy fire door clicking shut behind her with a sound like a gavel. Outside, the night air was cold and smelled of rain. Marcus Reed was waiting by the black sedan, his phone glowing as he monitored the live feed of the chaos inside. He didn't say a word, he simply opened the door. Maya sat in the back, the leather cool against her skin. As the car pulled away from the curb, she saw the flashing lights of a squad car turning the corner toward the gala. The countdown was over. The glass house hadn't just shattered, it was being ground into dust. Less than 5 minutes had passed since the heavy fire doors had latched shut, but inside the grand ballroom the atmosphere had curdled. The silence was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, thick with the smell of ozone from the projector and the cloying, suddenly suffocating scent of lilies. Maya Sterling was gone, but her presence remained etched into the glowing screen behind the podium, where the forensic audit of the Thorne-Sterling merger was still displayed in unforgiving, high-definition red. Julian Thorne stood paralyzed at the center of the stage. His skin, usually a curated shade of Mediterranean bronze, had curdled into a sickly, translucent gray. Sweat beaded along his hairline, dragging streaks of expensive foundation down his cheeks like melting wax. His lower lip didn't just tremble, it spasmed, a frantic, rhythmic twitch that made him look less like a titan of industry and more like a landed fish gasping for air. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now blown wide, the pupils swallowing the irises as they darted toward every exit, finding only the cold, judgmental stares of the people he had spent months deceiving. His shoulders, usually squared with unearned confidence, had slumped inward, making his custom-tailored tuxedo look 3 sizes too large, a shroud for a man who was already socially dead. "It's a fabrication," Julian croaked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked toward the front row, his hands hovering in the air as if trying to physically push the data off the screen. "A digital hallucination. Maya she's unwell. She's always been prone to these delusions of grandeur." The board chair, a woman whose diamonds usually sparkled with warmth, now looked at him as if he were an insect under a microscope. She didn't speak. She simply stepped back, physically distancing herself from the radiation of his failure. Beside her, the CFO was already on a frantic call, his voice a low, urgent hiss as he ordered an immediate freeze on all outgoing wires. A prominent socialite who had toasted Julian's vision only an hour ago now pointedly wiped her hand with a silk napkin, as if his very presence had left a film of filth on the air. "Enough, Julian," a voice boomed from the back of the hall. Alastair Thorne walked down the center aisle, the rhythmic tap of his cane sounding like the slow, steady beat of a drum. The crowd parted for him like a dark tide. He didn't look at the screen, he didn't need to. He looked only at his son, and for the first time in his life, the elder Thorne's expression wasn't one of disappointment. It was one of clinical detachment. "I've spent 40 years building the Thorne name," Alastair said, stopping at the base of the stage. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, embossed document. "I will not let a common thief finish it off. I've just finished a call with the district attorney. The accounts you've been skimming aren't Maya's. They were the firm's. You didn't just steal from a sleeping lion. You stole from the pride." "Father, listen," Julian started, taking a desperate step forward. "I am not your father," the older man said, his voice a cold, flat line. "I am the primary creditor of the Thorne-Sterling estate, and I am calling in the debt, every cent, every asset, starting with the watch on your wrist." In the corner of the room, the Sterling family was undergoing its own collapse. Beatrice Sterling gripped her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the wealthy donors she had spent years courting, but every head turned away. The social capital she had traded Maya's soul for had evaporated in a single heartbeat. "We had no idea," Serafina Sterling hissed, her voice high and panicked as she clutched her mother's arm. She looked at the reporters, her influencer instincts kicking in, trying to find a camera to play to. "We're victims too. Julian manipulated us. He lied to us just like he lied to everyone else." "You signed the affidavits, Serafina." Marcus Reed's voice cut through her frantic spin. He stood by the side exit, his arms crossed, holding a tablet that mirrored the one Maya was watching in the car. I have the footage of you and your mother moving the trust assets into Julian's shell accounts 3 weeks ago. You weren't victims. You were the cleanup crew. Beatrice's face went white. She looked at Julian, then at the police officers now entering from the foyer, their boots heavy on the marble. With a sharp, sudden movement, she let go of Serafina's arm and stepped away, her chin lifting in a pathetic, final attempt at dignity. I have a lawyer, she whispered, though no one was listening. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof of the black sedan. Maya sat in the back, the interior of the car smelling of expensive leather and the faint, metallic scent of the rain-dampened pavement. On the screen in her lap, she watched the live feed as the officers reached the stage. She watched as they took Julian's arms. She watched the way he shrunk, his knees buckling as the steel cuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the digital speakers. He looked toward the camera, toward her, though he couldn't see her. For a second, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The liquidation of the Thorn holdings is complete, Marcus said, sliding into the front seat and closing the door, cutting off the sound of the sirens. The trust is restored. Your mother and sister have been served with the injunctions. They won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without a court order by morning. Maya didn't feel the rush of heat she had expected. There was no fire, only a deep, settling cold. She reached out and tapped the screen, turning off the feed. The darkness of the car returned, lit only by the passing streetlights. They always said I was the one who didn't belong, Maya said, her voice a quiet, steady hum. She looked at the dark silhouette of the gala building as they pulled away. They were right. I don't belong in a house built on sand. She leaned back, the weight of the last 5 years finally beginning to slide off her shoulders, leaving something sharp and unbreakable in its place. The debt was collected. But as the car accelerated into the night, she realized that the ledger wasn't just balanced. For the first time in her life, she was the one holding the pen. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling legacy collapsed under the weight of its own lies. The city's social registers had been scrubbed of the names that once sat at the top of every invitation list, replaced by a clinical silence that Maya found more comforting than any applause. She sat in her new corner office on the 42nd floor, the scent of expensive sandalwood and fresh parchment filling the air. Outside, the skyline was a jagged crown of glass and steel, but inside, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock on her desk. Maya Sterling didn't look like a woman who had spent 5 years in the shadows. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Julian's monthly allowance used to be, and her hair was pulled back in a sharp, uncompromising blade. She wasn't just a forensic auditor anymore. She was the owner of the firm that now held the contracts for half the names in the building. The heavy glass door creaked open, and Alastair Thorne stepped inside. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the public shame his son had brought upon their house, but his posture remained regal. He carried a leather briefcase, placing it on the marble table with a heavy thud that echoed through the room. The final sentencing was handed down this morning, he said, his voice a gravelly hum. He didn't sit. He simply looked at her with a mixture of respect and a lingering, quiet grief. 8 years. No possibility of parole for the first 5 due to the scale of the wire fraud. Julian Thorne is officially a ward of the state. Maya didn't feel the surge of triumph she had once imagined. Instead, she felt a profound sense of equilibrium. She reached for a silver pen, the cool metal grounding her. And the restitution. The court has seized everything, he replied. The cars, the penthouse, even the watches he bought with your identity. It's being liquidated to cover the legal fees and the initial debt to the trust. He's left with nothing but the clothes they gave him at the processing center. She nodded slowly. She thought of Julian, who had once sneered at her for wearing off-brand shoes, now standing in a gray jumpsuit, his polished life stripped away until only the fraud remained. The sleeping lion had finally stopped biting because there was nothing left to consume. I spoke to Beatrice yesterday, Alastair added, his tone shifting to something more delicate. She and Serafina are living in a 2-bedroom rental in the suburbs. Your sister tried to start a new social media account, but the comments were unforgiving. They've been blacklisted from every club in the city. Maya pulled a cream-colored envelope from her top drawer. It was a letter that had arrived that morning, postmarked from the suburbs. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. She had already seen the frantic handwriting on the front, her mother's script, shaky and desperate. Beatrice Sterling wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for a temporary loan to maintain their lifestyle. Even now, with the roof caved in, her mother was trying to polish the ruins. "They still don't understand," Maya said, her voice calm and steady. "They think this is a hurdle. They don't realize it's the finish line." She stood and walked over to the shredder in the corner. The machine hummed to life, a low, predatory growl. She fed the unopened letter into the teeth of the machine, watching as her mother's pleas were turned into thin, meaningless ribbons of paper. The scent of dust and electricity rose from the bin. "What will you do now?" Alastair asked, watching the paper disappear. "I'm going to work," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I'm not auditing someone else's fortune to make sure they haven't stolen it. I'm building something that actually belongs to me." Marcus Reed had sent her a final report an hour earlier. The Sterling Trust was fully restored, the assets diversified and protected by a legal firewall that even Beatrice couldn't crack. Maya had won. She had her name back, her money back, and her life back. But as Alastair took his leave and the door clicked shut, Maya looked at the empty chair across from her. The cost of her victory was written in the silence of the room. She had no family left to call, no sister to share a joke with, and no mother to seek counsel from. She had traded a house built on sand for a fortress of ice. It was beautiful, it was permanent, and it was entirely solitary. She walked to the window and pressed her hand against the cool glass. Far below, the city moved on, indifferent to the rise and fall of legacies. She was the one holding the pen now, just as she had realized in the car 6 months ago. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw a woman who had learned that the only thing more expensive than a lie was the absolute, unvarnished truth. The debt was paid in full, and for the first time, the ledger was quiet. Maya turned back to her desk, picked up her phone, and began the next chapter of a life that was finally, indisputably, her own.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.